What kind of woman forces entire kingdoms to rewrite their history just to hide what she did to those who betrayed her? That is the question historians still refuse to face, because every surviving record hints at something so calculated, so unsettling, that even the chroniclers of her own era scratched out sentences and blackened entire pages. But traces remain. Whispers, symbols, scars on the land itself. And when you start piecing them together, a darker portrait emerges, the kind that makes you wonder how far a single human being can bend the world around her. The woman feared as the Witch of the North was not born into power. She carved it from snow, bone, and silence. Yet before her name sent warriors trembling, she was simply a figure that appeared where storms gathered. Villagers spoke of a pale light moving through the pines on nights when the wind held no sound. Wolves followed her but never attacked. Children claimed the forest listened when she passed. Adults dismissed these stories, but they lowered their voices when they did. Because the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. She watched people long before they realized they were being watched. Every kingdom north of the frost line eventually learned the same lesson. You could cross her borders. You could test her patience. But you could not betray her. The price for that was something no treaty could protect you from. Those who turned against her did not simply vanish. Their stories warped. Their families changed their surnames. Their homes were abandoned as if touched by a plague that no one dared name. And yet, there are accounts, scattered across monasteries and forgotten libraries, that describe her methods with a precision no myth could invent. A betrayal was not an ending to her. It was the beginning of a ritual. The chilling part is how ordinary the first signs seemed. A candle that refused to stay lit. Footprints around a home that led nowhere. Dreams in which a voice, not loud, but cold, asked the same question again and again, as if shaping guilt into a weapon. Some chroniclers believed she used herbs, poisons, illusions. Others insisted she used nothing but the truth, delivered in a way that forced a traitor to confront every hidden corner of their own fear. Because she understood something rulers and warlords never did. Terror is most effective when people believe they created it themselves. Even now, scholars debate whether she was a mystic, a strategist, or something neither category can contain. But the records agree on one fact. No betrayal ever unfolded the same way twice. She tailored punishment the way an artist selects color, stroke, and silence. Sometimes the body disappeared first, sometimes the memory, sometimes the entire lineage. You ever imagined what it means for history itself to recoil from a single person? If this makes your mind stir, leave a comment telling me what part of this story struck you first. Tap the like button to help this investigation reach more people, and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because what you are about to discover may reshape everything you thought you understood about fear, loyalty, and power. And the path ahead only gets darker. Long before the Witch of the North became a figure whispered about in distant courts, she was a child shaped by forces no chronicles dared describe in full. The official accounts say her village vanished during one of the harshest winters on record, buried beneath storms that lasted more than a month. But a marginal note in a damaged scroll from an old monastery mentions something else entirely. The storm stopped whenever she stepped outside. The monks who recorded that line later crossed it out with thick ink, but not before the impression lingered long enough to be copied by a second hand. It was the earliest clue that she did not simply survive the impossible. She grew because of it. By the time search parties reached the ruins, every adult was gone. Only the girl remained, sitting in the center of a burned circular pattern no one could explain. The investigators tried to question her, but she answered in fragments, describing shadows that spoke without mouths, lights that moved beneath the snow, and a presence that taught her how to listen when the world fell silent. They assumed her mind was broken from grief, They never considered that she was recounting, with unsettling accuracy, the moment she realized fear was something she could shape. She was taken to the nearest settlement, where families tried to care for her, but unusual things happened wherever she slept. Animals avoided the threshold. Water froze in bowls, though the fire burned hot. People dreamed of standing alone in white landscapes with no sound except a steady breath behind them. Some villagers believed these were omens. Others believed she brought misfortune. Whatever they believed, no one dared confront her directly. Even then, as a child with nothing but a tattered cloak and hair matted by frost, she carried an aura that made adults lose confidence in their own instincts. It was during these years that she began studying herbs, mineral compounds, and the peculiar behavior of northern storms. But what intrigued her most was the way people reacted when they felt watched. She learned their patterns, their fears, their quiet betrayals. She learned which secrets they guarded most tightly and how those secrets could be coaxed into shaping their behavior. Observing them was her first form of power, subtle and silent, a kind that required no force. People revealed themselves under her gaze without realizing it. One story survives from this period, preserved by a traveling healer who encountered her near a riverbank. He wrote that the girl approached him with calm certainty and asked why people lied when they were afraid of the truth. Before he could respond, she told him the answer herself. Because truth makes people accountable, while fear lets them hide. That line, repeated over generations, became the earliest expression of her philosophy. To her, fear was not a curse. It was a language, and she was learning to speak it fluently. As the winters grew harsher, so did her understanding of the world. She realized that survival was not merely about endurance, but about shaping the environment around her until it bent to her will. And those who interacted with her began sensing a shift. Their hesitation was no longer about pity for an orphaned child. It was something deeper, the instinctive recognition that she could see parts of them they would rather keep buried. And it was only a matter of time before she learned how to use that knowledge with precision. By the time she reached her 18th winter, the Witch of the North had transformed from a child who survived the storm into a figure whose presence alone reshaped communities. Tales describe her appearing in settlements during harvests, not as a beggar or a visitor, but as an authority that no magistrate or chieftain dared question. She learned quickly that fear could be measured, dissected, and directed. A misstep by a neighbor, a whisper of betrayal, an act of disloyalty. It all became a variable she could manipulate with terrifying precision. And she did so with the patience of someone who had been trained by winters that lasted half a year, and nights darker than human memory. One documented account, though heavily redacted, by scribes, tells of a trader who owed debts to multiple northern lords. When the witch arrived, the men thought she had come to negotiate, or perhaps to warn the boy. Instead, she began to alter perceptions. Candles flickered and extinguished without wind. Livestock panicked in enclosures. Doors closed silently behind her as if the walls themselves obeyed. And the trader, once confident, found himself confessing secrets he had carried for decades. Entire negotiations dissolved into trembling. Admissions of betrayal, not because she threatened death, but because the weight of her gaze made truth inevitable. It was during this period that she orchestrated her first punishments, the kind that would echo through northern histories. Those who betrayed her did not simply face execution. Their betrayal became a narrative she would shape. One man, a noble who had sold information to rival kingdoms, was reportedly left alive but unseen, his name erased from every ledger, every document, every household memory. Villagers claimed he wandered aimlessly through the forests, muttering to himself, forgotten by all but the snow and the wind. His family fled or changed their names, unaware that the methodical cruelty that claimed him was only the beginning. What made her infamous was not violence alone, but the psychological architecture of her reprisals. She engineered situations where guilt and fear collided, where the mind became the battlefield rather than the body. Witnesses, if any survived, could not recount events in order, because memory itself had been reshaped by her interventions. The North's monasteries recorded that nights after her presence, entire villages spoke in whispers, keeping secrets they could not name. Letters vanished. Confessions went unsent. The region itself became a testament to her growing mastery of influence. Her intelligence was not theoretical, it was experiential. She observed how loyalty fractured under uncertainty, how betrayal bred panic before any blade was drawn, and she experimented, gradually extending her reach, testing reactions, scaling the consequences. A disloyal servant might find a candle burning blue rather than gold. A messenger who lied could stumble across a river frozen in impossible patterns, forcing a physical confrontation with their own fear. Every tactic was calculated, a rehearsal for the major acts to come, when entire councils, armies, and even rival sorceresses would learn that crossing her was not just dangerous, it was catastrophic. And by the time the first historical records name her as the Witch of the North, she was no longer a girl. She was a strategist whose domain extended beyond geography into the very minds of those who thought themselves untouchable. Her victims, her observers, her enemies, they all became unwitting participants in her study of terror. She had discovered the formula that would define her legend. Betrayal was never punished alone. It was transmuted into a spectacle that rewrote memory, reshaped reality, and left those who survived questioning not just what they had done, but who they were. The first act of public vengeance orchestrated by the Witch of the North remains one of the most chilling examples of calculated cruelty in medieval history. When a high-ranking counselor betrayed her trust, historians whisper of what followed with hesitation, careful to soften the details. According to fragmented chronicles, she summoned the man to her hall, under the guise of reconciliation. The chamber was vast, lit only by torches that cast shadows longer than the figures themselves. The air was heavy with incense, the scent mingling with the frost that crept along the stone floor, as if even the walls were aware of what was to unfold. She began slowly, speaking in a tone that was both familiar and alien, recounting each slight, each whispered word of disloyalty. Every syllable was a scalpel cutting through the man's composure. He trembled, though he had faced armies and assassins before. What made her method terrifying was not the promise of death. It was the certainty that his mind would unravel long before any physical punishment could reach him. She orchestrated illusions of betrayal, using mirrors, shadows, and the faint echo of voices that were never there. By the end, he could no longer distinguish between truth and deception, memory and invention. Then came the ritual. She did not strike with sword or poison. Instead, she employed a ceremony so elaborate and psychologically precise that chroniclers admitted, centuries later, that no words could convey its horror. He was made to confront every choice he had ever made against her, every secret he had thought safe, replayed in the chamber and living tableau. Servants and witnesses, carefully selected, enacted scenes where his actions were reflected back with exaggeration and consequence beyond imagination. By the time she finished, the man's body remained, but his mind had been rendered fragile, his identity fractured. The psychological sophistication of this act was unprecedented. She transformed fear into art, punishment into performance, and betrayal into a lesson for all who dared to observe. And yet, this was only the beginning of her approach. The witch's strategies were never arbitrary. Each act of retribution was part of a larger framework, a system designed to create loyalty through terror and obedience through spectacle. Scholars who have pieced together fragments of these events argue that she may have consulted secret texts, knowledge from wandering seers, and even cryptic runes of the North that describe the manipulation of mind and perception centuries before her time. But here's the crucial insight. Those who watched her work did not leave unchanged. Witnesses spoke of a cold admiration mixed with terror, the recognition that she possessed a power unlike any human, one that extended beyond brute force into the realm of mind and memory. And for those who survived her wrath, a single question lingered. Could one ever betray her again? Or would the very act of crossing her become a personal torment that lasted a lifetime? If you can imagine the weight of that psychological grip, leave a comment below sharing what you think it would feel like to be under her control, even for a single hour. How would your mind respond to punishment that was crafted not to kill, but to erase certainty, to rewrite your very perception of reality? Reflecting on this is crucial to understanding the full scope of her power and why the stories of her deeds, though fragmented, continue to haunt those who study them. By the time the Witch of the North had orchestrated her first ritual punishments, word of her power had begun to ripple across neighboring kingdoms. Monarchs, generals, and emissaries traveled cautiously when they ventured near her domain, and some never returned. But it was not brute force that solidified her reputation. It was strategy. She had learned, through years of observing human nature, that absolute control required more than fear of death. It required fear of unpredictability, of consequences unseen and unrecorded. She understood that the mind itself could be a battlefield far more malleable than armies ever could be. Her next move targeted a council composed of seasoned warriors and advisors who had once believed themselves untouchable. They came expecting a meeting of diplomacy, perhaps even an alliance, unaware that each member carried secrets she already knew. When they entered her hall, the doors closed behind them with an imperceptible click, as if sealing time itself. A single torch flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to mock every step. She spoke slowly, recounting minor betrayals, decisions they had considered irrelevant, moments of hesitation they had long forgotten. Each story was tailored, each detail precise, each revelation designed to destabilize not just their confidence, but their sense of reality. Then she demonstrated her control over perception itself. Reports from the period describe how one general saw his allies betray him in spectral visions. Another heard the whispers of enemies in empty corridors. Yet another witnessed his own plans unravel before his eyes, as though the past had rewritten itself. There was no physical punishment, no immediate threat of execution, yet the psychological pressure was so exacting that some advisors were said to faint or flee in panic. And those who survived did so with a newfound reverence that bordered on obsession. To betray her was not merely dangerous, it was unthinkable. The witch's brilliance lay in the meticulous escalation of tension. She began to test the council members individually, creating scenarios that forced them to question what was real and what was illusion. Candles would extinguish in patterns she orchestrated. Scrolls of records, letters, or treaties would vanish or appear altered in ways that suggested supernatural intervention. Her ability to manipulate the environment, the senses, and the minds of even the most disciplined warriors became a form of political leverage unparalleled in history. Meanwhile, the stories of her domain, whispered along trade routes and through forest villages, painted her as a figure both feared and venerated. She was said to appear at night, cloaked in white frost, observing gatherings from treetops or shadows. Anyone who lied, deceived, or betrayed, even in trivial matters, was said to awaken to impossibilities. Doors locked from the inside, food turned inedible, shadows moving independently. By controlling perception and exploiting fear, she established a system of obedience and influence that required no physical armies, no sieges, no open battlefields. And yet, beneath all her calculated manipulations, there was another layer. She was not merely reacting to betrayal. She was creating a climate where loyalty and treachery became interchangeable concepts, testing the limits of human psychology. Each council session, Each public display, each whispered warning was designed to ensure that anyone who attempted deception faced not only personal consequences, but the creeping certainty that their very mind could become a trap. Her approach redefined power itself. Instead of conquering lands with blood and fire, she conquered perception. Instead of erasing bodies, she erased confidence and control. By the time her most ambitious council bowed under her influence, she had demonstrated a principle that would haunt rulers for generations. Absolute authority is less about what you can destroy, and more about what you can make others fear exists, even when it may not. The Witch of the North's influence extended far beyond punishment and spectacle. She had mastered the delicate art of creating invisible loyalty. Those who served her did so not out of fear alone, but because they had been, conditioned to believe their obedience preserved life, reason, and even reality itself. Servants, advisors, and allies alike became instruments in her intricate game, often unaware of the full extent of their complicity. Each action, each whispered command, was designed to reinforce the idea that she could see, measure, and respond to every thought before it even crystallized in the mind. Her methods were subtle at first. A servant who hesitated in delivering a message might find the letters misaligned, rearranged, or mysteriously duplicated. An envoy who lied about his king's intentions could hear the words of his own counsel twisted into confessions as he slept. She understood that the most effective control was mental, to make people believe that she knew what they feared, even before they knew it themselves. By doing so, she transformed ordinary loyalty into a form of devotion that bordered on obsession. But the witch was not satisfied with merely influencing perception. She sought to bind allegiance to ritual. Every oath, every promise, every minor transaction became part of a larger framework that reinforced her authority. She developed systems where seemingly trivial acts, lighting a candle at an exact hour, leaving a scroll untouched for days, even speaking certain words at precise moments, served as tests of loyalty. Fail them, and consequences followed. Pass them, and her favor, mysterious and compelling, became a reward far stronger than any coin or title. Indeed, this way, she created an ecosystem where obedience was internalized and fear and respect intertwined seamlessly. She also exploited the psychology of observation. Advisors, courtiers, and messengers were constantly reminded that every action was monitored, not necessarily by eyes, but by a network of rituals, omens, and subtle signs she had perfected over years. A misplaced token on a table, a faint line in the frost on a window, a candle extinguished too soon. These were all indicators that had to be interpreted correctly. One misread signal could bring shame, isolation, or a subtle psychological torment that left the recipient shaken for days. She had effectively made perception itself a tool of governance, teaching everyone that reality could bend to her will. At the same time, she cultivated a reputation that ensured her influence extended beyond her immediate surroundings. Merchants, travelers, and even rival lords shared stories of her ability to extract truths, enforce obedience, and punish betrayal without violence. Her name became synonymous with inevitability. Those who encountered her learned that resistance was rarely effective, and the cost of defiance went far beyond what mortal instruments could measure. It was not enough to survive physically. Survival required a constant attunement to her expectations, her signs, and her patterns. By the time she turned 20, the Witch of the North had established a network of loyalty that was both psychological and practical. Servants acted as agents, allies as informants, and even enemies as unwilling participants in her orchestrated reality. This system allowed her to influence regions without ever drawing swords, wage battles without armies, and assert dominance without entering conventional conflict. She had taken the subtlety of fear and amplified it to the scale of governance, creating a structure where obedience became automatic, almost instinctual, Her genius lay not in magic alone, but in understanding human nature with surgical precision. She knew how guilt, hope, terror, and desire could be combined into a form of power more enduring than steel. Every arrangement she made, every ritual she established, was designed to reinforce one undeniable fact. The Witch of the North did not simply command. She orchestrated reality itself, and those who served her, knowingly or not, became part of a web from which few could escape unscathed. The Witch of the North's most infamous rituals involved not merely punishment, but what historians later described as the erasure of memory itself. Those who betrayed her were not simply punished, they were transformed into cautionary examples, invisible yet omnipresent warnings for anyone daring to disobey. One account, preserved in fragments from a northern abbey, details a nobleman who betrayed a confidential agreement. By the next morning, he appeared unchanged in body, but when he attempted to recount his past actions to his peers, no one remembered him ever making those decisions. His family, his advisors, even his closest allies had no recollection. He existed as proof of what happens when loyalty falters, a living enigma whose mind was shattered but whose presence endured. She deployed her rituals with exacting precision. Betrayal was analyzed like a mathematical equation. The weight of deception, the value of the traitor, and the potential consequences of each action were calculated before the ceremony even began. Her tools were often mundane: mirrors, ink, wax, and fire. But combined with her understanding of fear and cognition, they became instruments of psychological annihilation. A misstep in the ritual could produce immediate terror. Success could reshape loyalty across an entire region. By the time the act concluded, witnesses, whether intentionally present or coerced to observe, would understand that defiance against her was not simply dangerous, it was an act of existential futility. A particularly chilling case involved a small council of 5 men who had conspired to share her secrets with a rival lord. She summoned them individually to her hall, each believing they would face a conventional judgment. The hall, however, was rigged with subtle devices: candle flames that twisted in impossible directions, reflective surfaces that multiplied their own images into grotesque parodies, and sounds that imitated their voices, accusing them of crimes they hadn't yet committed. One by one, the men began to confess, not under threat of death, but because their perception of reality had been manipulated so thoroughly that guilt became indistinguishable from inevitability. By the end, they were intact in body, but stripped of certainty, their memories fractured, their trust in their own judgment irrevocably altered. What made these executions, or rather, these transformations, truly terrifying was the way they reverberated outward. Stories spread of individuals who had been punished, but survived, and in every telling, the details grew more incomprehensible. Villagers and envoys alike learned that crossing her meant an untraceable, almost supernatural reckoning. Even those who had not yet met her felt its weight. By the time she concluded her first wave of ritual punishments, the North itself seemed to whisper her name with both fear and reverence, as if the landscape itself had absorbed her authority. The witch's genius lay in this delicate balance, instilling obedience, without relying solely on physical threat, reshaping the environment, perception, and memory until loyalty became internalized. Those who survived her gaze carried the imprint of her methods, stories passed down as warnings, never fully understood but always felt. And for those who dared speak of her deeds, words themselves seemed insufficient, inadequate to capture the precise terror and awe she inspired. Now, if you can imagine the psychological depth of her control, leave a comment below, describing what you think it would feel like to confront someone capable of bending minds, memories, and perception without ever raising a hand. Your thoughts are crucial to understanding the full scope of her power and how history remembers, or forgets, those who wield it. Beyond her rituals and psychological manipulations, the Witch of the North waged a war that few chroniclers dared to describe. A war not of armies, but of influence. She moved through the north like a shadow, unseen yet unmistakably present, altering the course of events without a single blade drawn. Borders shifted quietly, alliances crumbled under invisible pressure, and rival lords found themselves second-guessing every move, every command, every word. Her strategy was surgical. She exploited human nature itself, using greed, fear, and loyalty as her instruments, leaving those around her constantly uncertain and perpetually compliant. Her methods extended into the daily lives of those who served her and those who opposed her alike. She understood that control was most effective when it was not recognized. A guard who hesitated in her presence might wake to find his quarters rearranged, or that supplies had gone missing without explanation. An advisor might encounter letters whose contents had shifted overnight, creating confusion and paranoia. Even her enemies, unaware of her presence, often acted as though a force beyond comprehension watched over their actions. Each interaction, each subtle disruption, reinforced the belief that resistance was futile, that her awareness extended beyond what was possible, and that betrayal would always be met with consequences they could neither predict nor understand. In one particularly remarkable incident, chronicled through fragmented letters later discovered in a remote abbey, a rival sorceress sought to challenge her authority. She sent envoys to negotiate terms, believing her own mastery sufficient to counter the witch's influence. The envoys arrived expecting diplomacy, but found instead an elaborate series of illusions, symbolic warnings, and orchestrated visions. Mirrors reflected not the envoys themselves, but distorted versions of their fears. Candles extinguished and relit in unnatural sequences, signaling judgments they did not yet comprehend. They left trembling, their loyalty to their own leader shaken, and the rival sorceress never attempted confrontation again. The witch's silent war was not limited to individuals. Entire settlements felt the effects of her strategy. Crops failed in seemingly natural patterns that coincided with her presence, trade routes were disrupted inexplicably, and disputes between neighboring lords escalated without obvious cause. Historians later hypothesized that these were deliberate manipulations, crafted to demonstrate her capacity to control outcomes across a region without ever exposing herself to direct conflict. Fear and uncertainty became weapons more potent than swords, more enduring than walls. Her influence also extended into knowledge itself. She controlled what scribes recorded, what chroniclers remembered, and which events were deemed noteworthy. By shaping the narrative of her actions, she ensured that her legend became both terrifying and elusive, a puzzle that would challenge historians for centuries. Those who wrote about her did so cautiously, aware that a misrepresentation could bring misfortune. And thus, a pattern emerged. Stories of betrayal, punishment, and influence circulated in hushed tones, often distorted, yet consistently affirming her unmatched capacity to manipulate events from behind a veil of shadows. Through these campaigns, the Witch of the North proved that true power was not measured by the number of subjects ruled or armies commanded. It was measured by the ability to control perception, to bend reality to her will, and to render even the most confident enemies uncertain and fearful. Every choice, every hesitation, every secret decision in her realm became a reflection of her influence, and no one could escape its reach. The final acts of the Witch of the North's campaigns against betrayal were often unrecorded, lost to fear, or deliberately erased from public memory. Yet, fragments of correspondence, marginal notes, and whispered accounts reveal a terrifying pattern. She wielded her influence not to execute, but to remake perception itself, turning the concept of loyalty into an almost supernatural force. One of her most enigmatic strategies involved the so-called Silent Council, an assembly of individuals who had once betrayed her, but were now forced to participate in her designs without ever fully acknowledging their complicity. The Silent Council was a masterclass in psychological dominance. Each member was isolated, yet bound by subtle cues that reminded them constantly of her awareness. Letters arrived with phrases they had once written themselves, reorganized to highlight flaws, inconsistencies, and hidden betrayals. Shadows within meeting halls seemed to move independently, and whispers echoed in corridors where no one else was present. Over time, the council members' memories of events, promises, and allegiances became unreliable, leaving them uncertain even of their own identities. This method ensured obedience without direct force. The threat was existential, invisible, and omnipresent. Even beyond those closest to her, entire towns and settlements were shaped by her interventions. Rival nobles would awaken to find alliances subtly fractured, disputes manufactured by anonymous notes, and minor accidents, doors collapsing, livestock missing, fires contained just enough to scare, engineered with meticulous precision. She understood the fragility of perception and how the smallest shift could escalate into profound influence. Villagers, traders, and warriors alike began to anticipate her presence before ever seeing her, acting with caution, reverence, and fear. In essence, she controlled reality itself by controlling expectations and reactions, crafting a web of influence that extended far beyond her physical reach. One of the most haunting accounts describes a trader who believed himself safe after fleeing her domain. He returned years later, convinced the witch could no longer affect him. Yet, upon arrival, subtle phenomena began to erode his certainty. Familiar phrases in letters he had sent years before now contained added meanings. Reflections in glass seemed to whisper warnings. Distant sounds mimicked conversations he had had in secret. His own memories betrayed him, and within days he became a loyal servant without understanding why. To outsiders, he appeared changed, calm, and devoted. But internally, he was fractured, an example of how completely her methods reshaped minds. This final phase of her influence demonstrates a principle rare in history. Control can be more profound than conquest, more permanent than physical punishment, and more terrifying than death. By manipulating perception, memory, and trust, she converted betrayal into a tool that extended her authority and ensured that even those who survived her wrath became agents of her enduring power. The Witch of the North did not merely punish, she architected reality, leaving trails that haunted the living and ensured her legend would outlast the ephemeral power of kingdoms, armies, and rulers. Her mastery of influence and psychological warfare became the benchmark for understanding authority itself. For centuries, chroniclers and scholars attempted to reconstruct her methods, piecing together fragments from scattered manuscripts, marginal notes, and oral traditions. Yet no account fully captures the precision, subtlety, or inevitability of her strategies. Those who experienced her wrath, or observed her manipulation, described a pervasive sense of inevitability. Loyalty was no longer a choice, and betrayal was never safe. The ultimate reach of the Witch of the North extended beyond her lifetime, not through monuments or titles, but through the indelible imprint she left on human behavior itself. Her methods became the blueprint for control, the silent architecture of obedience, fear, and calculated loyalty. Entire generations grew up knowing her legend, not merely as stories, but as living, breathing influence that shaped decisions, alliances, and betrayals. The North itself became a landscape intertwined with her, memory, where geography, superstition, and psychology fused into a network of compliance that no ruler could easily dismantle. Even historians who approach her accounts with skepticism acknowledge a profound truth. The witch's genius lay not in brute force, nor in her rituals alone, but in the orchestration of perception. She could bend minds, manipulate memory, and engineer outcomes that seemed impossible to contemporaries. Betrayal, she demonstrated repeatedly, was not simply a transgression to punish. It was a tool to construct obedience, fear, and enduring influence. Her legacy teaches a lesson few other historical figures could claim. True power resides in the unseen, the unrecorded, the subtle manipulation of what people think, believe, and remember. By weaving her influence through both allies and enemies, she created a feedback loop of obedience and terror. Those who served her often did not realize they were instruments of her design, just as her victims frequently became agents of her enduring legend. Towns, councils, and families were all part of a larger pattern she controlled, one in which betrayal produced lessons that extended beyond the individual to entire regions. Every encounter, every observation, and every carefully orchestrated event reinforced her authority, embedding fear and respect in equal measure. And yet, for all the meticulous control and psychological artistry, the Witch of the North left space for curiosity, for observers to wonder, to fear, and to interpret her actions. She understood that legends are sustained not by certainty, but by questions that linger, doubts that persist, and stories that evolve over time. In that sense, her power was not only tactical, but philosophical, an enduring lesson in the subtle interplay between human behavior, perception, and influence. Now, for those of you who have followed this account to its final threads, take a moment to reflect. How does it feel to confront a figure who could manipulate entire regions, minds, and memories without ever drawing a sword? Leave a comment below with a phrase that reflects your reaction, something like, "I feel the weight of her control," or "This story shook me," so we can see how her legacy resonates today. If this journey into the depths of fear, power, and influence captured your attention, tap the like button to help this story reach more viewers, and make sure you are subscribed so you can continue uncovering legends like hers. And as you think about the consequences of loyalty, betrayal, and unseen power, remember that the shadows of history are never as distant as they seem. There is always more to uncover, more to analyze, and more to understand. For those ready to continue, there is a video waiting just next to this one that delves deeper into the hidden forces that shaped medieval strategy, psychology, and the silent reign of figures like the Witch of the North. Click over and continue exploring the shadows, because what you've seen here is only the beginning.